In this video, I'm going to go over the new Generators feature for PixelDesk. PixelDesk is an image editor for iOS and Mac. The Generators feature is only available on the Mac version. However, any images you create using the Generators feature on Mac will show up on iOS as image layers, as regular old image layers. Anyway, let's get started. So here I am on a blank project in PixelDesk. The new Generators feature shows up as this little lightning bolt icon. If you hover over it, it says Generate. So I'm going to click that, and boom, you get this UI with a bunch of settings on the right-hand side. The default settings are kind of interesting. So if I go ahead and hit Generate, I get that. Kind of a cool little design. So I'm going to go over what all of these settings do on the right-hand sides, just starting from the top and going down. Let me go ahead and set this background to white. Okay, so now we got a white background. So this may seem overwhelming, but I'm going to explain how all of this stuff works. Now, the Generators feature is an idea that I've had in my head for a long time now, and I've finally put it into code. And here it is. First of all, you have the subject. So what are we creating? In this case, we're just creating a random arrangement of circles, but you can choose polygons as well. And here we have polygons. You can choose triangles, diamonds, pentagons, hexagons, whatever gon that is. And you also have a setting for rotation. So when you set the rotation, let me put it back to triangles. When you set the rotation, that tells it how much the design is allowed to rotate. So if you set it to 0, you just get standard triangles that are only rotated in one direction. So if I change how the gradient is arranged, they're all rotated vertically 180 degrees. But if I turn up the rotation, they're allowed to rotate a little bit more. You can turn it all the way, they are allowed to rotate a random amount between 0 and 360 degrees. And now that brings us to distortion. Distortion allows you to basically randomize the geometry of the subject. The subject in this case being triangles. Let me just turn up the max size a little bit here. You can see this better. You can increase the stroke a little bit. So distortion, if you turn that all the way up, the triangles are no longer uniform, they are kind of randomized, which makes an interesting effect. And if you do that for circles, you get like these blob shapes, which I think are pretty cool and interesting to look at. So, and then there's also, in the subject section, there is the option for letters. You can have random letters in the wonderful American typewriter font that is available on every Mac as far as I know. So there we are with some random letters. I think those look pretty neato. Now let's go down to the size and frequency section. Let's put this back to circles, distorted circles. Now the size and frequency section controls basically how many subjects will appear in your design and how big they will be. How many and how big basically is what the size and frequency section determines. So if I put this all the way up, you get a bunch of big ass blobs. And then if I put the minimum all the way down, you get some big ones and some little tiny ones here on the bottom. So that demonstrates what that can do. And also you have these little multipliers. So if that is not a big enough maximum size for you, you can crank up the multiplier and make it even bigger. You get the idea. And same goes for frequency. So if this is not enough for you, you can crank up the frequency. And now you got a lot more little blobs. Let me crank down the size so you can actually see it. But that's a lot of blobs. And if I crank up the multiplier, I get a ridiculous amount of random little blobs everywhere. Looks kind of neat, doesn't it? Okay, so that's it for the size and frequency section. Let's go on to the gradient section. The default is a linear gradient. This is a linear gradient. You can control the you can control like the angle of the gradient by moving these controls on screen, these yellow handles. You can move these on screen and control the angle of the gradient. There you go. And we also can choose a radial gradient. So there's two options in the gradient section, one for linear and one for radial. The radial gradient creates a radial gradient. Let me turn down the frequency a little bit. There you go. There's a radial gradient. And now there's 3 settings for the gradient. There's 5 settings for the linear gradient. Let me go over those. So first you have size correlation. What the size correlation does is it controls how much the size of the subject is correlated to the gradient. So in this case, big is on top, little is on bottom. But if you reverse it, now big is on the bottom and little is on top. And then one thing to note, you can double click on any of these bidirectional sliders to get a value of 0. So if I double click on this slider, that is no size correlation. And now you can see that the blobs are random throughout the gradient. So essentially there's no size gradient. And that concept is similar to how color correlation works. So now the color correlation is all the way to the right. So if I move it all the way to the left, it just reverses the gradient of the colors. And then if I set it to the middle, there is no gradient whatsoever, and the color distribution is completely random. And now, which brings us to the final correlation setting, the frequency correlation. So what the frequency correlation does is it controls how many are at either end of the gradient. So if I crank this all the way to the right, you can see the effect that there are now more at this end of the gradient. There are more subjects at this end of the gradient than there are at the top. If I crank it all the way to the left, now there's more at the top. All right. And now we got the base and tip settings for the linear gradient. So what the base and tip settings does is it allows you to just control the shape of the gradient, essentially. So if I do this, you can play with that. So it just allows you to control the shape of the gradient. You can make it look like a triangular gradient, like so. That's what that does. All right. And that mostly explains the gradient section of the settings. And now that brings us to the stroke section. The stroke section should be pretty self-explanatory. That just controls the stroke of the subject. So if you have no stroke, there's no stroke, which makes it a little bit more interesting of a design. And you can increase the stroke all the way, and it gives you a nice thick stroke. And you can set the color of the stroke. Clicking on this color swatch brings up the macOS standard color picker that you're probably familiar with, and then you can control the color of the stroke using the color picker. Let's just stick with black. And now that brings us to the next section, which is fill colors. Now when you create a generator layer, which by the way is just a special image layer, it gives you this default arrangement of colors, which is something I came up with, which I thought was visually appealing, so I made it the default. But you can define any array of colors that you want. You can delete these colors and come up with your own array of colors. So you can hit the plus button to add a new swatch, add that color, add that color, add that color, add that color. I'm just coming up with this on the fly, so it doesn't exactly look all that appealing, but there you have it. And you can add up to however many colors it takes to fill up this square, okay? So it's not a scroll view. And you can also rearrange the colors. So you can drag to rearrange the colors in the array. Just drag and drop to rearrange the colors where you would like them to go. You get the idea. All right, and that's the colors. And now that brings us to the final section, which is rendering. So what we've been using throughout this demo is the regenerate, which is the default. And that means when you hit the generate button, it regenerates the entire design, okay? So when you hit generate, it regenerates the entire design. But if you change it to additive, when you hit generate, it adds to the design, see? So you get progressively more stuff. Most of the time you just want to use regenerate probably, but I can imagine a case where somebody might want to use additive. And now we have this auto generate checkbox, and that just controls whether or not the thing will auto regenerate after you change a setting. So when you change one of these sliders, it'll automatically regenerate by default. But if you don't want it to do that for whatever reason, you can turn this off and then see if you can if you change sliders, it doesn't auto generate, but hitting the generate button will actually make it generate. And then you have opacity, which just controls the opacity of the design. And that's about it. That's the generator feature of PixelDesk. So a little bit about why I created this thing, in case you might be wondering. Well, it's just an idea that I've had floating around in my head for a long time now, and I've finally just gotten around to implementing it. I've always liked to add these random geometric designs to like marketing materials and whatnot. It just adds a little bit of visual pop to things. Just makes things a little bit more interesting than they would otherwise be with just a plain background, you know? So essentially it's just for backgrounds, but it could potentially be used for, I don't know, some art that you put on your wall. I don't know, it's up to the creative individual using the software to figure out what they're going to do with it. For example, perhaps you want some abstract art on your wall with a bunch of random triangles. For example, I think this looks pretty cool. So to get this effect, you would turn all the correlation off and turn the rotation all the way up. And now you got a bunch of random triangles. Maybe change the distortion so that it makes it a little bit more visually interesting. And there you go. I'd hang that on my wall, wouldn't you? And here it is with diamonds, pentagons, hexagons, and sevengons, and octagons. I forgot what sevengons are. Again, there's a link in the description to the app. Give it a look. There's a lot of features, including AI art generation using DALL-E and a bunch of other stuff. I appreciate you watching. Cheers.